Hello, everybody, and welcome to this series of webinars that are connected with our project Multilingual Families Clubs, which together with our partners all across Europe, we're trying to promote the intercultural and multilingual heritage of Europe. In this series, I would like to focus on key aspects, both theoretical and practical, that are related to communication, languages, and interaction within societies in general. I'd like to focus on three basic elements. Basically, first one, to understand what culture is and how culture affects us all around and how we interact within this various mix. Secondly, I'd like to focus on aspects of communication and what makes communication good, because that's what we're focusing on. And finally, I'd like to show you the background of how we worked up towards building this, these products that we have connected with the project, and the theoretical and practical secrets from behind the camera that you never see when they're being done across time. My name is Adam, and I work at the University of Social Studies and also at the branch campus for Clark University here in Poland. I've been chosen to do this because I myself have this type of background. I am a multilingual, bilingual especially, person who comes from a Polish family, but was raised in a multicultural environment in Canada all the way back in the 1980s, so that was a long time ago. But kidding aside, I had to deal and combine with my Polish home reality with the multicultural aspect of what Canada is, along with also language differences, because my school, my preschool, and my friends, they spoke English, while my parents spoke Polish, and I was put into this intercultural and multilingual mix and tried to figure it out from the very beginning as a young child. And I'll tell you about the multi-benefits that you have from having the best of both worlds, as we aim to promote within this culture, or within this project, that multiculturalism and thus multilingualism is something that should not be feared by parents, but in fact it should be supported in order to give that child a further chance in life, not only in this globalized environment, but might actually push everybody to start understanding more why certain people behave in certain ways, why people think in certain ways, to see this otherness as something good, as opposed to something threatening or that needing to focus just only in one element, because that's not the case. So throughout this series of webinars, I'd like to bring these aspects closer to you so that you would further understand why it is equally important to remain multilingual if you are a multilingual and a multicultural family. So first, I would like to share my screen, and my first presentation for you is entitled Multiculturalism and Human Conduct. So in other words, how a multicultural environment shapes and changes a human being over time, so that we arrive at a position where we're more able to understand these differences and how these differences influence us and how we will interact. So first, I would like to start with various definitions of culture, because students come up to me and ask, how I would define culture. Well, there's at least 150, if not even more, definitions of culture. But basically, in the 1950s, they were defined, or they were summarized into various categories, and we grouped them into a kind of how to approach a culture, so to speak. So the first category that was assigned was topical. Now, what does that mean? As you can see, culture consists of everything on a list of topics or categories such as social organization, religion, and the economy. So the themes in the background, the way that societies are run, by the way their organizations, by their social grouping is established, by the various religious aspects or ideological aspects that then survive within a given culture, and also on how we on an everyday level trade, do business, and interact in order to survive. The other category that was proposed was historical culture. And here we're looking at social heritage, right? Something that might be referred to more as tradition, and how we send these traditions and leave them for our posterity. So things that we both did right, and for both things that we went wrong. So that's another thing that you have to understand about cultures is they all develop over time. It's a national, it's a basic evolutionary model of change that happens across time. And certain things are done badly, and future generations come up and fix them. But they always originate from where we come from. It's interesting enough because through our heritage, we see how far we have progressed, how much we have moved to today. Then we have the behavioral aspect, which sees culture as a form of human behavior, something that is learned over time, right? That is, in a sense, acquired. So what does it mean to acquire something as opposed to learn something? Well, learning is conscious. Is conscious redoing things that we see. It's copying. But acquisition is a process where we subconsciously become a part of the whole or part of the collective, in which we do it intuitively by, of course, observation. So as a young child who listens and observes the behavior and languages of the parents, we start imitating that, but we start doing that at a subconscious level, that we're not thinking about the fact that we're learning it. And that's the behavioral acquisition of cultures and languages. So that acquisition of a certain way of life is something that we share with others. Then we have the normative approach to culture. So culture is ideals, values, or as simply put, rules for living. This is okay and this isn't, right? So in our cultural reality, or in our cultural terms, certain aspects are agreed upon by a general society, and that might result from the historical aspect or the behavioral progress of a given culture, and are then transferred to future generations. Then we have the functional approach, in which culture is the way humans adapt to the environment or adapt to each other. So this is looking at how we interact. So we're molded in a certain way by our source culture, but then we see a different culture and how we tend to connect and evolve beyond that. So it's like two elements coming together and then going forward. And that is that approach. Then we have the mental culture, which is the complex mix of ideas, habits, right, impulses that we have that distinguishes us as human beings, right, from other animals. So it's mentally input or programmed into the mind, which again, I'll be talking about later on when referring to Hofstede. We have structural cultures. So that consists of patterned, interrelated ideas, symbols and behaviors. And finally, finishing off with symbolic, which is the way that we arbitrarily assign meanings that are shared by society. And arbitrariness is a very important thing. It will come into play later on, because certain ideas may be universal. There are certain universal facts, but there are various non-universal approaches to assigning meaning to symbols. So like, various hand gestures or hand signals that can be used in different cultures and are interpreted in them in different ways, so that when we learn about this, we learn how to interact in a given society. So let's say our misunderstandings or misunderstandings of other people and their cultures are a result of the fact that our symbolic cultures see certain things that we transform into per se linguistic, and they say certain things which were not meant to offend in the original, but they're actually quite offensive if they're used in a particular way. And that's where translators come in, and teachers and cultural managers, which need to make people aware of these differences. So, for example, if I were to be told that I am a pig, by a Chinese speaker, then I would not be offended because he would be just referring to the year of the pig, so the year in which I was born, as opposed to the arbitrary assigning of the way that we're a Virgo or a Cancer, etc., that we use signs of the zodiac here. So if I would be called, oh, you look nice for a pig, which would be very offensive, but to me that could be a compliment, because the year of the pig, by my general physique, you might assume that I was born, so I have so and so many years. So if somebody says that I look good for a pig, that means that I have aged well and I'm looking well. But again, it's very arbitrary and it's a very slippery slope, which can cause problems. But at the same time, this can cause more and more understanding between people. Now, when I talk about culture, I like to refer to the works of Jens Alwood of the University of Göteborg. And his classic definition from the 1990s is that culture could be said to be the conventionalization of nature, and language is viewed as the most prototypical of all examples of these processes. So we refer to regional and social group formation as being a part of a culture, the activity patterns that we have, and various aesthetic values which we share. And this is to what Alwood called these four elements. One of them is the patterns of thought. So what makes up a culture? First of all, the way you think, right? And we obviously think in a language. So the language is the obvious tool that we're using in order to communicate, but through this, we're using, again, symbolic elements, right? Semiotics is what does research into the study of signs. So by putting these signs together, we've arbitrarily given them certain meaning, which expresses our thought. So again, this is a certain element that is very important because, again, we think and we create the word through understanding through our languages. So that's one element of the culture, the way we think. So common ways of thinking connects us. Then we have patterns of behavior. So the way that we behave, what is considered to be proper behavior, what is considered to be improper behavior in a certain culture. Going from the way that people would use or eat food or use utensils, right? And that is a certain pattern of behavior. Then he looks at what he calls artifact manufacture. In other words, what we produce on a daily basis, right? Starting from food to the way we built our houses, the way that we surround ourselves by the products which become the very essence of our culture. And now recently everybody's been talking about cyber culture or internet culture. And well, yes, the smartphone would be a good example of how that produces, how that becomes the tool. And finally, what he does about traces in nature. In other words, how we use the world around us, the world which surrounds us. And I don't want to use the word how we exploit it, but how we make use of what is given to us and how we treat the surrounding nature, how we built around. I think Tolkien explained this best when he created the culture of the elves in the Lord of the Rings trilogy and all these other books, is that instead of cutting down the trees, the elves would naturally fit their homes around, as opposed to, you know, everything that goes on in Mordor, where nature is completely used for machinery and it's kind of like an industrial thing. So again, we have this clash of these traces in nature, meaning the more ecologically friendly natural environment as opposed to the industrialist approach. But again, Tolkien, when he was writing that, those was in the post-First World War era, the era of great development. So that was one of the questions which was being asked by then. So this is a necessary element also in cultural understanding. So once again, it's how we think, it's how we behave, it's how we produce, and how we exist or coexist with the surrounding environment. So of course, there are further aspects which we could look into. And as I said, this is a never-ending field of intellectual discussion, which changes because societies change, right? So that is the key reason why we should be looking at this from an interdisciplinary point of view, because our culture, our own culture, the one which we're living in, if we call it Western or European culture. It's also been changing. So it's in a constant fluid state, and it will never remain the same, because we need to start treating cultures as living, breathing organisms which are developing. They're finding new paths and new ways to take. So Hall called it a vast unexplored region of human behavior that exists outside the range of people's conscious awareness. Unexplored region, because for those of the future, those of the past, even looking at European culture has changed so much thanks to the mix of cultures, to the further understanding of the beneficiaries that may come, the people who may take beneficial elements from this and move it forward. Ferraro said that it is everything that people have, think, and do as members of a society. So as functioning members of a society, we have an obligation to then further create, to develop. And that's, again, an ever-expanding source. Then we have a system of symbolic resources shared by a group of people, and the collective programming of the mind. And here we're coming to one of the most important and influential, not only in the area of culture studies, but also in management. Mr. Geert Hofstede, who called it the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one group or category from another. So in a sense, Hofstede already started talking about this as something which he called programming. And this is what he came up with. It's like a pyramid, right? So at the top, we have the personality of every individual. These are the traits that we inherit or that we learn in life and by the surrounding environment. But they're very specific, because they're only specific to the individual, and they cannot be treated universally. Because even if we look in terms of languages, languages have dialects, and then finally they have idiolects. Idiolects are individual ways of speaking, right? So nobody's going to copy my speech pattern, because my speech pattern is individual to me. Therefore, my personality is also individual to me, and therefore we cannot, on the basis of me, create stereotypical universalist thinking that this is what a person is, whether it's Polish culture or Canadian culture, because I'm a mix of all that. And that's very extremely personal to me. Then under personality, we have the ever expanding culture, which is specific to a group or a category. So a group of people who are sharing the same space, having the same values, thinking similarly, right? And interacting with nature similarly. And that is something that is learned, that we learn over time. And finally, the universal element is simply human nature, right? That is inherited. It is universal. We cannot change human nature. And the biggest problem on the level of intercultural communication is that you have to balance these three elements out. Your individual personality, the culture which you come from, which has molded you into the person you are today, and finally that with which we all fight, our own human nature. So when talking about cultures, there's so many differences that we can take into use. So we differ from each other on a national level. And I was asked once by a student who asked the very question, why do there need to be nationalities? Well, it's very simple, because it's a prime instinct to come together to be a group, right? Human beings are social animals. Working individually doesn't produce the best results. And humanity has always had its best results when it was working together. So only by working together can we, by coming to groups, we fund, even if they be called national, as names given to people who reside in countries in different parts, right, and are administratively run. But it is a human need to be a part of a group. And these groups are exactly these layers of culture that we study and that we try to focus on when trying to understand intercultural. So the next is regional, gender, generational, social class cultures, Organizational class cultures, so the way that we perform in certain organizations. Uh, we call it our school culture, our workplace culture, all different types of layers. And all of that connected by this unique human ability to communicate via speech, which is then comes out of the languages. So this already should give you some idea of how multilingualism, multilingualism in effect leads to multiculturalism. So the more linguistic codes we use, so again, thinking, but I'll talk about that later. Thinking in those codes will allow us to better understand the national, regional, gender, generation, social, organizational, whatever, right? We'll start understanding how these things come into function. Many of us, many immigrants, many people who travel for work or because of various crises like we're seeing over the last years, are trying to find ways to live a normal life. So they come to Europe and they want to become, and they are becoming extremely a part of our culture, but we never actually think how that person might feel. And here I'd like to focus a moment on something that we call cultural shock, right? And something that happens. This was first used by the anthropologist, Mr. Oberg, in the 1960s. And it referred to feelings of alienation and acute awareness of being different, of people who enter an unfamiliar culture. Well, first of all, we have the language barrier that starts there, right? We start having problems with communication, and through the lack of that communication, we start generally having negative reactions. They're both physical, cognitive, and psychological, where we have to move between these bubbles of all these different layers of culture that are already established in a given region, right? And here, if we look at the stages of cultural shock, then they are as follows. We have the stage one, which is many people call the honeymoon, right? When you move, you've got an adrenaline rush. You've always wanted to move, you always wanted to come here, or you finally feel that this is where you're going to grow your roots and start your family's future, and that's the enthusiasm that you get, right? Everything is new and different. People appear friendly. Your problems just vanished. People frequently get this when they go on vacation, right? They go to a different country because they don't have to work. They leave their work behind. They leave their problems behind. I'm going on vacation, and they say, wow, everything in this country, everything in this society is perfect. I can move here, right? I can start my life here. It's the enthusiasm. But then comes stage two. Stage two is the crisis, because you've already moved. You can't live on good feeling forever. So one begins to notice differences. You feel out of place. You feel that people kind of look at you differently because you don't belong. And yes, I did have that feeling when I came to Poland. I was 10 years old. I was put into a new environment, and although I was accepted as Polish, but they even didn't call me by my name. They used a nickname. They used to call me Canada. Hey, Canada, come out and play. So I already knew I was the different guy, right? That I didn't belong here. And was this my home? I had this feeling of alienation. So again, for a child of being 10 years old, I know how that feels. So for you as a parent, if you think that your child is not going through the same thing that you might be going through, it's a life-changing event. But the important thing is to get through the crisis, because stage three is the recovery. You've survived the shock of a new culture. You learn some of the language and the other aspects, and you start functioning normally. And by being normally, certain elements from stage two start naturally disappearing, and you accept and go into stage four, which is the adjustment. One becomes accustomed to the new cultural element or surroundings and starts developing routines. And once the society accepts you behaving within that culture in what they deem acceptable, you're accepted. But again, you should remember that it's the cultural heritage that makes it richer. Then show your origins, and suddenly your origins become interesting to the people. For example, at my school in Canada during the holiday season, we had symbols for Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, and any other religious groups that were there, which actually got us as kids very much interested. So what does Hanukkah look like? Okay, what does Christmas look like? And we asked all these questions. We felt safe that we could ask these questions because we knew that. Oh, and if something was fun, we could adapt it into our culture. So suddenly, certain things that would be unheard of in my home because they were never traditions, right? You brought them in. You brought them in. You brought them in from those other cultures because I had friends of various cultural backgrounds, and to this day, some of that is me, and I do continue with those things that I've learned. So the adjustment is you retaining your identity, but taking on, let's say, a new one and enriching the new one. And when everything works perfectly, they're supposed to interact with each other. However, life, I know, doesn't work that way. And maybe I make this sound too glorified, but in practice, if you work on it, it really comes through, right? I celebrate Thanksgiving, even though it's not a part of Polish culture. I carve a jack-o'-lantern on Halloween and put it, although it's not observed here in Poland. But those are things that will stay with me to the rest of my life. And I've passed some of these things on to my son. And even though he's only been there visiting, he liked the fact that his dad had these things that he can share, and that hopefully he can share with his kids and find out who his dad was in the long run. Therefore, if you're coming here from a different culture, or you yourself are going on outside Europe to a different culture, try to enrich it. Go through stage 2. Don't rush it. It's going to take some time. A child will do it much more quickly because of the natural mechanisms still within the developing brain. But for you, remember, it will pass. Don't hold on. And that will allow the process to go faster. But again, as I said, I know that's not the way the world works. That's why we have these 3 types of culture shock representatives. We have the rejectors, individuals who, finding it impossible to accept a new culture and integrate, isolate themselves. They isolate themselves, they go do their job, they do what they have to, they don't want to do anything, don't want to become anything of that, and that again poses a certain threat, because when your child is living in the culture and it's actually bringing some of those elements to your home, many people decide, the rejectors decide, no, this will not be happening in my house, because okay, it's your house, I understand, but from the child's perspective, that child needs to function within the society, and it cannot be rejected. Therefore, we cannot then use our rejector approach and instill it into the child. Because the child is going to be an adopter. It's individuals who integrate fully at the cost of losing their original identity and intend to remain in the new country forever. Right? That could be your child. But your child, in the long run, could also become what is good, which is cosmopolitan. Individuals who accept some of the aspects of the new culture while still keeping and cultivating their own, thereby creating a blend of the 2 cultures, allowing for that child to later in life better understand colleagues and peers at work, better to move forward in business as well, apart from linguistic values, meaning knowing languages, it's also knowing those cultures. It's easier to understand. Those people are like gold for global markets because they know how to do business. They understand the culture of the society, and they're greatest at their job. So if we look at this, I'm actually using this picture of an iceberg, because we only see certain things at the tip of the iceberg. We don't see what is underground, under the water, right? So that's the hidden layer. So we only see visible behavior, but we don't see is the invisible attitudes. And that's one of the most important aspects of this, of intercultural communications. Since we started with Hofstede, let's continue along this way. Because Hofstede's framework involves 5 dimensions of culture. And now these are equally divided into low versus high power distance, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, low versus high uncertainty avoidance, and long versus short-term orientation. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about that. So low versus high power distance. What types of cultures are these? This dimension measures how much the less powerful members of institutions and organizations accept and accept that power is distributed unequally. So we're talking about power, higher versus lower power. And from a certain point, if you look at our lives, we've always got somebody above us, right? We're born, there's our parents. We go to school, we've got the teachers. We go to university, we have instructors. We go to a job, we have our bosses. And then in life, for those people who are religious, there's the Almighty. So in this sense, the cultures which are structured around the idea that the higher up the ladder you go, right, but you're still never in control, right? So in this case, subordinates acknowledge the power of others based on their formal hierarchical positions. So this is something that you could easily see in corporate culture or in work culture, right? This affects very much the communication tone, right? Again, in Polish, I would have to use sir in front of the person who's my boss. But in an English context, you know that you can refer to your boss sometimes by their name, but that does not change your position in the hierarchy. In other words, you remain where you are. You're not the boss. Even though you use my name, I'm still your boss, and I'm still going to decide what happens to you. So that type of culture ultimately exists. So we have the signs and symbols of power here. We have education, profession, family connections, age, gender, language, dialect, and accent, dress, titles, greetings, office arrangements, all types that put us within a certain hierarchy in which elements of culture are then structured. And they're structured according to, if you remember at the beginning, to various historical, symbolic, mental, behavioral, whatever types of elements that make up that particular culture. So definitely, we're going to have cultures like this around the world. So in hierarchical cultures, communication tends to be restricted and comes from the top and goes to the bottom, right? So we're talking about areas where we're talking about, let's say, certain harmony in a society where certain rules simply cannot be broken, because with them comes the entire strategy behind the culture. Then we have individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. So basically individualism versus collectivism. This is how much members of the culture define themselves apart from their group membership. Even look at your family status, right? Certain cultures by structure or by, let's say, stereotypical thinking. We're used to thinking that Italian, that Spanish, Portuguese, Greek families, people of the Mediterranean area in Europe, they are very much collectivistic because of the importance of family and collectivist structure. Whereas, for example, the United States, as being outside Europe, that's a very individualistic culture, looking at individuals and how they strive to go up the ladder. And here you have what Sue called the concept of the person or the self, the concept of self, right? So this results in what we could then call cultural scripts. The concept developed and discussed by Wierzbicka, which refers to the manifestation of a particular attitude, evaluation or assumption, which is shared by the people of a given speech community, which influences their verbal interactions, right? So self develops the cultural scripts. Then we have, so the individualist cultures, individuality and individual rights are dominant. Business is transactional and competitive. A person's identity revolves around I. Individualism is encouraged, whether it be personality, clothes or music, or the way that we personalize things on our iPhones, that we get personalized information. So a lot of what is part of digital culture is the so-called individualistic culture. Now, the collectivistic cultures, this is the ties between individuals being very strong. It is pivotal to be a group. Space and privacy are less important than relationships, right? Communication is intuitive. It's complex. Business is relational and collaborative. We is more important than I, right? It's stability, order, and a certain obedience to certain set models, right, of interactionism. So when you're listening to this, ask yourself, what kind of a cultural background do you come from? Then this is what Hofstede called masculinity versus femininity. And again, we cannot focus on gender aspects here because I'm not distinguishing between male, female biologically. This is what Hofstede meant as certain values that are traditionally applied. So he called this traditionally male values versus traditionally female values as we have in Western culture. So masculine is social gender roles are distinct. Men supposed to be assertive and tough. Women supposed to be tender and concerned with more quality of life. And in feminine, its social gender roles overlap. Both men and women can at times be assertive, but also tender and concerned with the quality of life. So in other words, it's a plus minus thing. It's a 0-1, right? So not, again, not biologically, but more aggression versus passive. A masculine culture is treated as more aggressive, while feminine culture is treated as more neutral and more natural. So Hofstede never meant to describe how gender empowerment differs in cultures, but rather uses the term masculinity to capture certain traits. If one looks at the cultures with a low masculinity rating, they will notice that many also have gender equality. For example, in the Middle East. So the terms relate to nurturing, and I think that's a much more a better terms that we could use nowadays. So nurturing cultures versus assertive cultures. So this is much more complex, and again should be understood on this level of aggression versus building, on destruction versus nurturing, etc., etc., etc. Then we have low versus high uncertainty avoidance. So how members of society attempt to cope with anxiety and minimize uncertainty, right? In cultures with high uncertainty avoidance, people prefer explicit rules about religion, food, and formally structured activities. Employees tend to remain longer with their present employer, right? So you built a certain expectation that you want to achieve in life, and you reach that point and you stay there. It's the status quo. These are the cultures which don't like, and these are the people and individuals who don't like change. They're very uncomfortable with change because they work to assure themselves a certain position, but then, well, that change involves something different, something going in different perspectives, and they don't like that. And there are those who are fine with it, right? And even right now, we have examples of young people going from one job to another, etc., trying to find, always searching. And then we have long versus short-term orientation cultures, right? So this dimension describes a society's time horizon or the importance attached to the future versus the past or the present, right? So it's this vast area, unexplored area between persistence, right, respect for tradition, and stability. So although the world may be changing around us, there are those who will be persistent in their cultural heritage, respect for their tradition, and stability. So as you can see, this is a large spectrum of how cultures are understood. And it is multilinguals and multi-communication and multicultural communicators. So people who have adapted these different elements through learning cultures, through languages as young children. So you're already preparing them to easily deal with all these different elements that I've just shown you, that that person has to subconsciously, have within their elements. Now, communication and culture. So let's look at various types of communication. Now, we have communication as seen as rhetorical. So communication is a practical art, right? We have semiotic approaches to communication. So communication is intersubjected mediation by signs. So we already touched upon the signs before. We have the phenomenological approach, where communication is experience of otherness. It's the dialogue. We have a cybernetic understanding, where communication as information processing. The socio-psychological communication is seen as expression, interaction, and social cultural, which is reproduction of the social order. And finally, critical, which basically looks at communication as reflection. So if we look at cultural approach to organizations, this contends that people are like animals who are suspended in webs that they themselves have created. Theorists in this tradition argue that an organization, meaning language, meaning national culture, or religious culture, or any other types of culture, is composed of shared symbols, each of which has unique meaning. Organizational stories, rituals, and rites of passage are examples of what constitutes the culture of an organization, right? And we all share and take part in this all the time. Therefore, a person who is bilingual, multilingual, which eventually becomes bi or multicultural, can much more easily meander this bumpy road and easily understand and avoid certain technical problems related to behavior, and then easily interact and avoid many of the bad things that have happened. Now, theorists in cultural studies maintain that the media represents ideologies of the dominant class in society. Now, because media are controlled by corporations, the information presented to the public is necessarily influenced and framed with profit in mind. Cultural studies theorists therefore are concerned with media influenced and framed with profit in mind. Cultural theorists therefore are concerned with media and influence and how power plays a role in the interpretation of culture. So this is the negative aspect. This is something that we have to look out for, and especially when we're looking at multicultural training for young children, that sometimes we perceive reality through this, which is, again, another form of control and stereotypical thinking. From my experience, the best way to travel, the best way to know, the best way to become is to go and do it for yourself. In other words, the negative stereotypical thinking that sometimes is given to us about different cultures is completely different when you arrive and you see the people interact in their societies and how they talk to each other, how they eat, what they eat, how they share values, what are their their national cultural interests. It could be a lot different than what has been portrayed in certain media outlets. So again, that's something to look out for. And now I want to come to something which is called conventionalization. Conventionalization, as Andre Marmor from the University of South Carolina said, these are species of norms, rules that regulate human conduct. And conventions have an essential thing in common. That is, they're arbitrary. Arbitrary means that they can be interpreted in different ways. That is, certain suggestions that certain norms is conventional is to suggest that a norm is, in a sense, the norm, because it's just a norm that we follow. Though we could have followed a different norm, right? Instead, without any significant loss in the point of following the norm that we are actually now following, right? It's arbitrary. Why do we do this? Why is this considered norm? Who has chosen it? It's not maybe that we're trying to find any one person who is creating that norm. It's more we are looking for understanding why something is considered to be at this point in time. So again, that refers to how cultures develop over time, right? How they change. And naturally, languages, that's the way they changed, right? If we look at most of the languages spoken in Europe, right, we belong to the Proto-Indo-European language family, which then broke off into different daughter languages. So Germanic, Slavic, Italic, etc., etc. And then they, again, broke into individuals. So as we were forming into groups, we were creating these communication channels based on our cultures, and we established those norms. But right now we live in a globalized world. We live in a digital world. We live in a world where monoculture, and thus monolanguage, is not a thing anymore, right? It is a part of our European tradition right now that we are many, right? And we share different norms, right? Which are for our cultures, they're there, but they can be arbitrarily different depending on what other culture uses. And this has pretty much to do with our emotions, right? This has pretty much to do with our emotions. It is the study of what is an emotion. Now, I'm not going to try to give you a lecture on psychology, but by basically emotions perceived as perception of psychological condition result from particular stimuli. Right? The first original definition from 1884. Thus, we have various cultural, conceptual, and also cognitive approaches to understanding emotions. So, for example, affective events theory, developed by Weiss and Cropenzano, which sees phenomena as being a direct result of events affecting behavior and thought. So this kind of coincides with what we talked about when we talked about the rejectors in cultural shock. Because it is that emotion that you get once you do something, which will then determine your perception, which will determine the way you feel about what and how you approach that given event. Now, let me give you an example. If you arrive in school and you don't like your teacher, and your teacher is somebody who had, well, a bad day that didn't perform well for you to accept it, then the next time you're going to come in, you're not going to feel quite well with the teacher. So you have a negative effect at the very beginning. It's probably going to influence everything else. So if you start, even from a multilingual point of view, if we start having fun with languages, right? If a child says, as I don't want to use the word traumatic, but a non-positive approach to using those two languages, that child is going to reject them, right? It's simply those affective events. Well, conceptualization and definitional discussion of emotions for various frameworks has given us conflicting results across disciplines, right? Norman and Picard, for example, stress aspects as experience and interaction with the surrounding world, arguing for emotion as an important factor in cognition, right? While Shearer sees emotions as an impediment of cognition and rational perception of reality, providing distinction into aesthetic and utilitarian emotions, and the latter occurring prototypically patterned events. So again, it's making the system, putting the system into proper use, all right? But definitely, emotions are a part, and they do affect our perception, and they will be affecting our perception of, first of all, cultures. But in this case, and what we're trying to say, that multilingualism is fun and good for you, if there's a negative element over there in there, then that is going to be truly affected. Therefore, it is imperative when you start having fun with your languages, of your cultural backgrounds, of your cultural descendants, the child needs that positive stimulus to get it forward. Linguists have argued for conceptual categories of cognition, emphasizing that meaning actually emerges from socially and culturally shared practice and norms, implicating that interpretation has social origin. So recent investigations suggest that within the cross-cultural framework, processing emotions remains the same. So it doesn't matter if you come from this culture, if you come from that culture. The processing of emotions of your is exactly the same, and it is not culturally dependent. It is individual dependent. So what I'm trying to say is that a key element in supporting or accepting cultural differences is acknowledging the fact that many of our perceptions are in fact a result of emotional approach. So let's study demonstrated the cultural component in emotion manifestation with the phenomena being grounded in social cultural contexts. While universalists argue for independent nature of emotion conceptualization, relativists see representation as based on linguistic and cultural conditioning. There's a huge gap in science, and there's huge research being actually done into processing emotions and how linguistically we process them, as we have different words to describe them. So therefore, again, learning a language, learning how languages are structured, learning how they work on this pattern is also a part of your child's emotional education. So the more languages he speaks and the more he is able to use that language to describe those emotions, it's easier to contact again and have these cross-cultural contacts, etc. So as an example, refer to contemporary studies carried out on representation in the media. It appears that media-based representation of events on emotion arousing strategies, patterns, and conventions that allow viewers to become direct participants of the actions taking place. So in other words, emotion becomes a manipulation strategy. So interpretation or perception of events is conditioned by emotions and other affective phenomena, along with a set of culturally and socially interpreted schemas, which arise due to a set of manipulative patterns. So in this sense, emotions are also a part of understanding and learning and behaving in this cross-cultural environment. So if we're talking about cross-cultural, multicultural perception, then we're talking about behavior and gestures. And we've already mentioned that certain gestures are maybe offensive in one culture, but may not be offensive in another culture. So beware of that. Sensitivity and self-consciousness, the knowledge and beliefs, and perception of reality. And here we come to language and why it's so important to start at a very young age. There is a theory called linguistic relativism. Linguistic relativism is basically about the fact that we perceive reality through the prism of our languages. In other words, it's a tool with which we paint reality. And the tool with which we paint reality will be the way that we understand that reality. Therefore, if your child has the ability to paint multiple realities, if you understand my analogy, if that child is able to paint in those different realities, then that child will definitely be more capable of becoming multicultural and understanding. So language is the key here that puts multilingual into multicultural, because that's the hidden prize that you get at the end of the journey. And that's why it's very important. So intercultural competence, that's knowledge, information necessary to interact appropriately and effectively. It's motivation, it's the positive effect towards the other culture, and skills. Behavior necessary to interact appropriately and effectively. Knowledge, motivation, and skills. And skills are acquired. Now, you may have a natural talent but your skills are naturally acquired by you actually doing it. So you're going to acquire multicultural skills when you start multilingual. That's why, dear parents, it's extremely important. If you are using two different languages at home and you're having two different cultures at home, that's only beneficial for your child, because a multilingual family is a multicultural family, and a multicultural family better understands, therefore communicates more effectively. So even though it's something as simple as knowing two different languages, but it's in fact two different realities. And this is something which we sometimes call linguistic identity. And am I Polish? Am I Canadian? What am I? I guess I'm a bit of both. So I'm a Poladian, or some other made-up word. So the best of both worlds. And that has, for me, benefited me so much that it has allowed me to become a better person and to better understand and want to understand everything across this large spectrum. So in conclusion to the presentation, culture shapes experience and communication. And again, communication, you use the tool language. So the more languages, the more tools you have, the better you're capable of communicating across cultures. Culture affects our view of reality. It shapes experience and communication. Culture affects our view of reality. It's the most important element here. Therefore, if those are used, then in a relatively closed social system in which communication among members is unrestricted, the system as a whole will tend to converge over time towards a state of greater cultural uniformity. The system will tend to diverge towards diversity when communication is then restricted. So the point I'm trying to make here is that all this background, all this cultural meandering between realities starts at the language level, starts at conceptualization, starts at thinking. Therefore, the hidden prize at the end of a multilingual family is a multicultural child. And a multicultural child serves society, serves communities to a large extent. Because in this case, it is easier, it is more, again, from my personal experience, I understand without words. I understand the hidden context. I see the hidden layer. I'm proud of my multilingual heritage, even though I come just from Polish parents, but I had the opportunity to experience that otherness. And this is, quite frankly, the most important thing. And why we should do that? Why should we become multilingual? Well, that will be the subject of a different recording. I hope you have enjoyed this small trip through understanding multiculturalism, which again results from multilingualism. And if you have any questions, then I can give you my home address, my email address. You can call, you can send me an email or anything, and hopefully I'm interested in seeing your points of view on the intricacies of multicultural communication. Thank you.